In early 1945, the war situation developed not necessarily to Germany's advantage, especially the surface fleet of this marina, wherein a majority of the large surface vessels had been sunk previously. Still, there were several ships left in various states of readiness, ranging from ships like the light cruiser Leg to incomplete vessels like the aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin. Much like other ships we have discussed in this series, the light cruiser assisted in the defense of the Baltic cities as the Red Army advanced and was eventually captured by the advancing Allies. The light cruiser Leipzig was found to be in a bad state following the war, so much so that she was not allocated to any victorious power and sunk in the Skagerrak in 1946. The Graf Zeppelin was found to be in poor condition and sunk in weapons testing in 1947 after being captured by the Soviet Union. Graf Zeppelin, I've covered the development and overall history of the Graf Zeppelin in another video, and so in this video, we'll pick up her story in 1936 as the design of the aircraft carrier was well on its way and could be included in the planned naval expansion. And the carrier was included in that year's budget, while a second carrier of the same design was added in 1938. The Deutschenwehr and KE was given the contract on December 28. Almost 2 years later, on December 8, 1938, the aircraft carrier slipped into the water, being christened Graf Zeppelin by the daughter of the Count. Around 15,000 people watched, including top government officials, as the ship was towed to the fitting-out area. There, the builders would add on to the ship, including the island structure, funnel, mast, and Atlantic prow, which was in addition to the bow to strengthen it for the rough ways of the Atlantic and North Sea. The fitting out was quite the interesting process as the design evolved and construction continued, resulting in many delays. By September 1, 1939, in the start of the German invasion of Poland and wider world conflict, the ship was considered to be 85% complete, and this is where an armament change occurred, as the main battery weapons were shifted from 16 15-centimeter guns as opposed to the 20-centimeter guns proposed earlier in the design phase. Pier site at Kiel, Graf Zeppelin, was due to be complete by October 1, 1940, and was scheduled for sea trials that winter. However, with a year to go, work slowed to a crawl as the war demanded the Navy focus its attention elsewhere to have an impact on the war. Interestingly enough, work had begun in 1938 on the other carrier in Kiel at the Fleet Kolb Gammon, but the project was cancelled on September 19, 1939, being broken up in February 1940, and the pieces used in other projects. The name was allegedly to be the Pistassa, but little to no documentary evidence exists of this, and what does refers to it as Aircraft Carrier B. Getting back to Graf Zeppelin, by the spring of 1940 in the invasions of Denmark and Norway, which proved to be costly for the CIS Marina, losing 1 heavy and 2 light cruisers, 10 destroyers, 6 U-boat, and the 2 battleships of the Charhorst class were damaged. Not to mention the Pensac Lutzow, formerly the Deutschland, was severely damaged by a torpedo. With this in mind, and priority placed on the completion of the 2 38-centimeter armed battleships, Wismar interprets work on the Graf Zeppelin was officially suspended for the time being. To add insult to injury, the ship's 15-centimeter guns were removed and sent to Norway as coastal defense guns, and its anti-aircraft guns were sent elsewhere. The completion date was set to January 1941, at the earliest, and at least a year of sea trials after. With the machinery not yet operational on July 6, 1940, Graf Zeppelin was towed from Kiel to Gottenhofen, or today Gdynia. This move was to bring the carrier out of range of RAF bombers. Not really, though, as RAF bombers in August 1942 attacked the ship, but no hits were scored. Going back to 1940, the ship languished there for almost a year, where, anticipating the invasion of the Soviet Union, the ship was towed to Stettin, this time in hopes of being out of range of Soviet bombers. As the war developed, the entry of the United States into the war caused the movement of the Kriegsmarine surface fleet and other units to Norway to interdict convoys from Britain to the Soviet Union, during which operations when heavy units, like Tirpitz, sortied and almost came close to being hit by aircraft torpedoes, and her sister suffering that fate earlier in 1941. The fact became apparent to Admiral Estrada that for this North Norwegian sea strategy to succeed, he needed carrier-based aviation to help locate the target convoys and act as support for carrier/battleship task forces. The mounting evidence for carrier-based strikes grew, culminating in Hitler's order for the completion of Graf Zeppelin. This decision was made in April 1942 in a meeting at Führer HQ between Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine staff. One can imagine the tension in the meeting, as by this point there was quite a bit of animosity between these two services. It was agreed that half the machinery was to be complete or at least enough to steam at 25 to 26 knots, and some other modifications, like increasing the anti-aircraft battery, with the carrier to embark on a dozen Bf-109TS and 28 new Ju-87E as its aircraft complement. However, it would take time to train crews, as Goering had moved the previously trained carrier groups around for his purposes. The ship was to be towed to Kiel for these modifications and completion, with an important one being the replacement of the island staff mast, with a tower containing the ship's command and weapons control center, and flight director station, and a shrapnel-proof housing. On top would be 8 tons worth of radar equipment. At this point, the ship had a noticeable list because of miscalculations in the original design, and the additional weight on the starboard side only made the problem worse, requiring counterpoise bulges added to the starboard side of the keel, and with a port bulge being constructed. These bulges also served as external fuel tanks. A confirmatory meeting with Hitler was held in mid-May 1942, during which time the conversion of the unfinished Hipper-class heavy cruiser Zidlitz and merchant vessels was discussed. However, Graf Zeppelin was to be done by April 1943, and sea trials between then and 1944. Once operational, the ship was to join other units in Norway, escorted by minesweepers and patrol vessels. Graf Zeppelin was towed back from Gdynia, where she had been towed to previously, arriving in Kiel on November 30th, 1942, slipping into a 40,000-ton floating dry dock so the hull modifications could begin. Engineers began to work on the machinery in the ship. The other modifications previously mentioned began, and shortly after the carrier's arrival back to Kiel, Italian naval officers came to inspect the ship as they were studying German technologies for possible application to their carrier project Aquila, something I talk about in my video on Aquila. This would be the closest Graf Zeppelin would be to completion. On December 31st, 1942, the attack on convoy JW-51B failed, sending Hitler into a rage, where he ordered all work on heavy ships now building or in the process of conversion to cease. All battleships, cruisers, other than those needed for training purposes, to be put in the reserve. This also resulted in the resignation of Admiral Arisha and the appointment of Admiral Kyle Donuts to lead the Kriegsmarine. This Donuts managed to save most of the heavy units, but not the Graf Zeppelin. On April 21st, 1943, the carrier was towed from Kiel to Staten, arriving 2 days later, being towed to the Monet estuary and anchored and abandoned the river, where the dream of naval aviation for the Marina died. As the Red Army advanced and came close to the ship in April 1945, she was scuttled with explosives, wrecking the boilers, turbine rooms, electrical generators, airplane elevators, and opening the hull to the sea. In May, the Soviets found the scuttled ship and set their naval engineers to reflat her. To clean up this section and a few other loose ends from this series, let's look at SPO of War, The Fate of Enemy Fleets After Two World Wars, by Aidan Dodson and Serena Kahn. They write, in addition to these two ships, the Italian Julio Cesare and the Finnish Vyborg, the USSR was in possession of several other capital ships, all of which were placed in Category C and were thus due for destruction by August 15, 1946. This was not achieved until October of the following year when the destruction of these vessels was certified. In the interim, the Soviet authorities had indeed toyed with the idea of retaining and repairing some vessels, with Schleswig-Holstein added to the Navy list in March 1946 and Graf Zeppelin in September 1945 as a potential trial ship for future Soviet-built aircraft carriers. However, their poor condition, leaving aside the international obligations, made this untenable, and all ships in question were directed in March 1947 to be destroyed. They go on to report that to gain the highest possible value from the heavy cruiser Luftwaffe Leopard and the Schleswig-Holstein, they were to be expended in ordnance trials in the summer of 1947, of which we will cover Schleswig-Holstein in the next installment. While the Lutillo, as discussed in her section in a previous video, had a mysterious end. Or so I thought, as Kent and Dodson report that she was refloated and sunk in the Central Baltic on July 22, 1947. Finally, Graf Zeppelin, renamed PB-101, was the subject of similar trials as she was sunk in a live fire exercise, proving to be rather tough, surviving multiple simulated bomb hits and torpedoes going down in the late summer of 1947. You can find photographs of her wreck online, a very interesting Google if you feel so inclined. Our final ship for today's video is the Leipzig light cruiser Leifek, a ship we have not discussed on the channel. She will most likely get her own video at some point in the future, but for the sake of this video, she was similar to her sister, the light cruiser Nunberg, and an improvement on the K-class of light cruisers. We'll pick up her story in early 1943, as she was part of the general decommissioning of heavy units, and her ensign was hauled down at Libau on March 4, 1943. In the worsening military situation, however, there was still plenty of work to do even for a worn-down light cruiser, and a permanent company was mustered, and she began working up once again in the same year. On August 10th, a potentially serious fire broke out in Boiler Room 3, but was swiftly extinguished. As I mentioned, a worn-out light cruiser. Steaming flak exercises in shipyard trues were the name of the game for the next several weeks. After a brief stint in dry dock to repair the port propeller, she assumed training duties in the Bay of Danzig in early September, continuing this for the next several months. Meanwhile, on October 9th, she assisted in the defenses of the city of Gottenhofen, the future Gdynia. She had her forward torpedo tube mountings taken off and new radar installed during this period. Later in December, between the 15th and 25th, her main gun barrels were unhipped at Gottenhofen. The cruiser was laid up until the 5th of January 1944. During January, the cruiser went through an overhaul in the Deutsche and Kiel where she was given new 15-centimeter guns. I should mention that all of this work did not stop the training courses, as they continued as the ship was laid up and had work being done on it. The ship was finally worked up and ready by late August 1944. However, she was further delayed by an outbreak of cerebral spinal meningitis on the 30th at Swinemunde. Therefore, the ship went into quarantine until the 12th of September, with 2 dead aboard due to the disease. On the 15th of September, the ship conducted exercises with the heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, and on the 26th, Leipzig ran several escorts for troop transports between Gottenhofen and Swinemunde. On the 30th, she sailed for Hella with the U-boat tender Tsingtao and a U-boat, and on October 4th, exercised off the port with the Admiral Hipper, Pun, and the old battleship Schlesien, a ship we will cover in the next installment of the series. They proceeded in convoy for the shipyard in Danzig between October 9th and 14th. Leifzig was anchored off Guttenhofen, where a chain of terrible events led to the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen ramming the Leifzig. As detailed in Captain Sprell's immediate accident report, Fleet Command was pressuring the light cruiser to sail, as they expected the cruiser to be back in Gottenhofen by the 15th. However, there was no time to make the proper pre-sailing checks, and critically, no time to get the boilers up to pressure. Instead, Leipzig was running under central propeller powered by her cruising diesel. Taken directly from the report, I ordered the ship closed up at war stations. And when I came on the bridge, the wireless officer handed me a signal warning that the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, returning from Memo, would be entering Gottenhofen at about 8 p.m. Standing orders stated that the second copy of a signal be handed simultaneously to the NO on the bridge and then passed to him by the IO. Unfortunately, the second copy of the signal was intercepted by the IO, and neither the NO nor the officer of the watch saw it. Thus, they knew nothing about the Prinz Eugen. This is where the engines come into play, as the boilers had been worked up and were now ready to be coupled in. This complicated process of coupling in the outer propellers necessitated the ship to stop. The ship had just stopped in the wrong spot, as once the ship had completed the coupling in, came the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, taking from the ship's war diary at 7:58. Ship got underway with orders for 15 knots on course 90 degrees, which meant she was not athwart the channel. Prinz Eugen had navigation lanterns set dimly, and they could not be seen in the conditions of dark and mist. It was thus not possible to judge her angle of approach. Only her masthead steaming lights were visible. Accordingly, the Liskwo acted correctly by attempting to avoid the steaming lights dead ahead by turning to starboard. Aboard the Prinz Eugen, the officers were taken by surprise when Leipzig's navigation lanterns came on suddenly. Prinz Eugen was making 20 knots, which was excessive for the swept channel. Leipzig ran foul of her at about 9 knots. As soon as she was seen by the lanterns, Prinz Eugen set her night signal apparatus to 3 red and 3 white alternating lights, which means my engines are at full stern. Having regard to the short distance involved, the effect of reversing was negligible. Whatever the case, the bow of the Prinz Eugen sliced its way through the leaf, causing some serious damage to her stem, and of course to the Leipzig, carving its way between the battle mast and the funnel almost to the center line, and held the light cruiser fast between her center keel plate and upper deck. The two ships were stuck together until 2 p.m. on the 16th, where Leipzig was eventually brought into the 70,000-ton floating dock in Gottenhofen, where it was found the bow of Prinz Eugen had torn through boiler room number 3, tearing away the bulkhead between boiler rooms 2 and 3. In the accident, 19 were killed and 30 were wounded. The ship remained in dry dock until December 30th. A proper repair was out of the question due to the worsening war situation. But the crew was ordered to make the ship seaworthy using improvised tools and materials. Eventually, though, the damage was found to be so serious that she was relegated to being a training hulk for cadets, limping from one spot to another in the harbor to avoid air raids. Eventually, though, she was deemed needed due to that worsening war situation. And with the damaged state of the shipyard in Gottenhofen essentially ceasing to function, a blind eye was turned to any means of improvisation, and measures included expropriation. By early March 1945, the cruiser was worked up, and on March 9th, the Soviets were within range of her 15-centimeter guns, firing at positions near the assembly. Pointed Tecum, the Soviets targeted Leipzig, forcing her to change positions very frequently, either within the port or out at sea beyond the range of Soviet artillery. Leipzig fired 920 15-centimeter shells, causing serious damage to the artillery positions. On March 17th, the 7th Panzer Division signaled to thank the ship for her outstanding shooting. Her flat crews were also hard at work, trying to deal with Soviet aircraft overhead, earning themselves decorations. By the 24th of March, there was no 15-centimeter ammunition left, and the ship was moved to Hella to embark 500 refugees and Army wounded before heading westward, accompanied by 6 merchant vessels and a few small escorts. She could only make 6 knots, and waters patrolled by Soviet submarines. One torpedo was narrowly avoided by a sharp turn to starboard, and on the 26th, Soviet torpedo bombers were driven off, eventually making it to the Danish port of Anod. She would remain there until the 30th of June 1945, when under British escort she was brought to Wilhelmshaven. Here, she was decommissioned on December 20th, 1945. Because of her desolate condition, she was not wanted by any of the victorious powers, and she was first used as an accommodation for minesweeping crews, and was scuttled by scuttling charges on July 20th, 1946, in the Skagerrak. Some sources discuss her sinking being part of chemical munitions destruction. Still, due to her sinking by scuttling charges instead of opening the sea, it's not likely, at least according to Dodson and Kant. This is one of my favorite series on the Conclusion channel, as it discusses some lesser-known ships like Leipzig and their rather unique fates. I think the next installment will deal with the remaining battleships of the Kaiser's High Seas Fleet that were still around during the Second World War, and especially 1945. Thank you all so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. And until next time, my friends, have a great week.